Welcome back to Piers Morgan Uncensored. The California Reparations Task Force this week voted to approve recommendations on how the state can compensate black residents for historic discrimination. Governor Gavin Newsom has praised the task force but appears to be cooling on its advice, perhaps because it could cost $1.2 million per person. This debate is everywhere right now. The British monarchy has faced repeated calls for reparations for historic links to the slave trade. Well, BBC journalist Leo Terrell recently quit her job to campaign for reparations, having donated £100,000 herself to Grenada, where her family historically owned slaves. So is this a form of historic justice, or is it just divisive? Well, I'm joined by a member of the California Reparations Task Force, Jovan Scott Lewis, and Fox News contributor and civil rights lawyer Leo Terrell. All right, welcome to both of you. Jovan,
Thank you.
Let me ask you about this, because on the face of it, I've talked about this quite a lot recently, I don't understand how the pain from historic sins gets eased by bunging a load of cash to people now, almost all of whom will have not suffered the original pain. So explain to me.
Sure, thank you for having me. So what we're doing in California is we are dealing with some of the more recent experiences of discrimination, beginning with the period of Jim Crow here in the state of California. So what we call these are really the lingering effects of slavery. And so we're not providing reparations or recommending reparations for slavery itself, but for the ongoing institutional and state-based harms that the African-American community has faced.
But it's not only African Americans. I mean, look, slavery was an evil, evil thing. Nobody denies that. But it's not just African Americans who have suffered historic sins and ills against them. Where do you take the logic of this argument? Does every community in the world who has been mistreated historically, are they all worthy of financial payment? And if so, how is the world going to pay all this stuff, given we're already suffering a global financial crisis?
Right, that's a fair question. So what we're doing in California is we have effectively calculated the economic losses that the black community faced as a result of state policies. And so we're effectively tracing, the capital that this community lost over the past, century and a half of discriminatory, state policies. And the argument is that we're building a reparations proposal around those direct losses. In addition to that, we have, dozens of policies and programs that are helping to effectively end the kind of discriminatory cycle that African Americans have faced in the state.
Who's going to pay the bill?
But thankfully, that's not the task force's job to figure out. Our job was to create a methodology for compensation, for calculating those harms, and we're passing it along to the state legislature. I think the state has a variety of options of how to pay for this. The state, if it decides to pay for it, again, we are recommending compensation. We have come up with calculations for how compensations can be arrived at. But the state has a variety of, I think, instruments and approaches to how to stretch out a payment if they decide to do so.
All right, let me bring in Leo Terrell. You've been waiting patiently. Your response to this, Leo?
Well, you've done a great job of asking the right questions. First of all, they cannot prove any form of direct damage at all. I challenge him as a lawyer, as a civil rights lawyer, Piers. Here's the situation. They talk about institutionalized racism. Where is it? You got black mayors in this state. They talk about systemic racism. Where is it? Where's the white boogeyman that they're talking about? They cannot prove that people of color, black folks, deserve $1.2 million. Does Kamala Harris need it? Does London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco? Does Karen Bass, Barbara Lee, who's a congresswoman? They can't show this. What's the real reason behind this, Piers? I'll tell you what it is. In 2020, during the summer of riots, you had a governor named Gavin Newsom who wants to pander to black Americans in California in order to run for president. And I will submit to you that if such a bill was even contemplated, there would be a challenge to it because it violates the Equal Protection Clause, it's unconstitutional, and it's racist. And I would be the first, as a civil rights attorney, to challenge such a law. Last point, Gavin Newsom came out a couple of days ago, Piers, and said he is not inclined to support reparations in a cash payment.
All right. Listen, you've made some fiery points back there. So, Jovan, I guess my overview has been about this issue. Are we now in this country, for example, going to seek some form of payment from descendants of the Romans and the Vikings for their marauding around Britain? And if not, why not? In other words, what's the difference really ideologically behind what you're striving to achieve for the African American community for historic issues and that? And me saying, well, I'm sure some of my ancestors were mistreated by Romans and Vikings. I'd like a large check, please.
Sure. And that's a fair question. And, you know, counter to your other guest's claim, we have established the exact record of harm. What we're talking about is that the African-American community, as recent as 1973, here where I live in South Berkeley, was demolished. A commercial district was demolished to build a train station. You're talking about African-American communities that were demolished to build highway systems. So the record of harm is clear. It is direct. And I really do welcome your other guests to view the interim report that we released last summer, which is a 500-page detailed report of the specific and direct harms that African Americans in the state have faced at the hands of state policy. And that's what we're this is what we're
But I would say this, Jovan, I mean,
reparations.
there are other communities. The gay community of the world, right, have all had discrimination from the state. Right, you could argue. And you could argue that's caused a lot of pain and harm. So do members of the gay community globally, are they entitled to take your lead and say, right, we were discriminated against by states, we want money for it? In other words, where do you end?
Sure, where you end is with state responsibility. And so if those other communities and any communities can establish an actual record of state harm that is intentional, and what I'm saying is that these harms were intentional. We're talking about redlining, where black communities were directly targeted by state dispossession. We are talking about an exact record that has been established. And so if any community can establish a similar record, then I encourage them to make a claim. This is what we're talking about.
Okay.
This is not about a cultural issue. This is about a record of harms that the state should be responsible for.
I understand, and you've expressed yourself in a very civil way, and I appreciate you for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
And also to you, Leo Terrell, thank you very much indeed to both of you.